Yes, and welcome to your week 2 lecture, where we'll be discussing setting the larger context of prisoner reentry. Our learning objectives for this week are that by the end, you'll be able to differentiate the goals of reentry from the realities of reentry, argue whether community supervision is a help or a hindrance to the goals of reentry, and explain how addiction is linked to reincarceration. So, social support is a major influencing factor in whether someone will be successful reentering society after incarceration. And while reentrants rely on social support systems for emotional, financial, physical, and other types of support, over time these can become a source of stress and strain in those relationships. Moreover, mental and physical health issues present additional challenges for reentrants. So we will look at what it is like for reentrants to return home to their social support systems, but also consider what it is like for those the reentrant is leaning on for support. So the first article we're going to discuss is But They All Come Back, Rethinking Prisoner Reentry. And what this article really talks about are three main themes in reimagining what reentry could look like. So we sometimes overlook the importance of the moment of release to not only the offender, but their family, the victim, and society and the community as a whole. So we need to look at the reentry process as it presents opportunity for advancing social goals. So a major goal is to prevent the reoccurrence of antisocial behavior and promote productive activity that's valued by society. However, because of a lot of truth in sentencing, we're not releasing people based on readiness to change, but because they have served the necessary amount of time. And parole violators are a large number of those who end up being reincarcerated. Moreover, we use drug treatment programs, restorative justice programs, and cognitive behavioral programs that start in prison, and we need those to continue while someone is on supervision. So there isn't just a disconnect between what they're getting while they're incarcerated and the programming available when they return home. We also need to look at the role of a reentry manager as being redefined. So, using probation and parole officers in the community to reduce violence and violate those who are not compliant with probation rules. They're spending more time in high crime areas, sort of like community policing efforts, or using Operation Nightlight, where they work directly with the police to surveil those areas. So, really using that reentry manager as someone who is out in the community, a community member and a community player who knows what's going on, who's really focusing on reducing violence in the community, not just simply violating those for simple rule violations. And the argument is made that the judiciary or the judge should play a greater role in managing reentry. So using the judge actually as the main reentry manager would allow for one person to oversee all efforts of the various players. And then the planning could begin the moment of sentencing, which if you look at really any reentry programming, any reentry research, reentry starts the moment a person is incarcerated. Because from that moment on, the plan should be, how are we going to make this person successful when they return home? And what services are they going to need? What does this person need? Having that continuity or continuum of care that starts in prison and continues once they're released. We then move on to effective probation strategies to respond to signals of poor progress on supervision. And the results of this study really showed us that multiple supervision strategies have poor long-term outcomes in reducing recidivism. And those supervision strategies include things like electronic monitoring, drug testing, contacting employers or collateral contacts, using house arrest or curfews, and phone-based monitoring systems where there's no real face-to-face interaction, and using restraining orders or financial conditions. Really, these don't help people in the long term to reduce recidivism. But what does work are therapeutic tools, such as cognitive behavioral programming, which we'll return to throughout the semester, and workbooks or worksheets that target criminogenic needs. And we have a plethora of these in the probation and parole system, mostly in juvenile, and it's starting to become larger in the adult world now. And some prisons and jails use them as well, where you have worksheets that an individual will actually sit down and complete with their case manager, with their parole officer, that goes over sort of situations that have happened and how they could handle them in a different way, talking about their thoughts and their behaviors, really talking about pros and cons of the negative behaviors they've been engaging in, and then pros and cons of a positive behavior that they could replace that with. So really working with these individuals on a more detailed therapeutic level can increase their chance of success on supervision. And success during the first 6 months is most often occurs when the officer is using incentives and sanctions. So incentives for positive behavior, sanctions for negative behavior. Of course, sometimes those sanctions may be supervision strategies like giving them a curfew or making them come in for an extra office visit. However, incentives can be things like increasing curfew or telling them that they don't need to come see you this month, you'll come see them at their home. So using those in a way that really demonstrates to the offender or the individual in supervision that almost showing them and mirroring what you would like to see out of them. So it's here for positive behavior, you get incentives. For negative behavior, you get sanctions. It's just sort of teaching them what are the right and wrong things to do on supervision. When the officer prioritizes treatment services or cognitive behavioral programs, we really see a lot more success within those first 6 months. So making sure that the person is receiving the mental health, drug and alcohol treatment they need, and that they're participating in those cognitive behavioral programs that's going to address not only their negative thought patterns, but also their negative behaviors, and has them act out those positive behaviors so that it becomes second nature to them. Increase in monitoring requirements actually was shown to have success within the first 6 months. So increasing the monitoring requirements is really just keeping closer tabs on an individual. And then again, sort of using those worksheets. It was also interesting that officer actions were found to be more important than individual characteristics of an officer and can promote success for those under the age of 31. Because they tend to have more complex needs and they're identified as at risk for violating supervision. So for all of these types of individuals, officer actions over their individual characteristics prove to be more important, which is interesting because sometimes you'll have officers say, I just don't think I'm the right person to talk about this with the individual. And what it's saying is that not necessarily would be the case, even though you don't feel like you're the best person, your actions are more what matters. What you show that person matters. And there's a lot of pro-social modeling we do in the criminal justice system, particularly in probation work. When we talk about core correctional practices, pro-social modeling, effective use of authority, effective use of disapproval are all things that we teach officers so they can be those role models for these individuals and teach them essentially sort of right from wrong that they've never been taught. And then we talk about the article From Supervision to Opportunity, Reimagining Probation and Parole. So first we need to understand what our probation and parole populations look like. Well, 4.4 million people are on probation and parole. They're also 3 times more likely to be unemployed, 2 times as likely to be poor, receive government assistance, or be in psychological distress. They're 2 times as likely to have less than a high school education, and they show higher rates of residential instability. And again, you'll see all of these are very common of reentry populations that we'll talk about throughout the semester. They're less likely to have health insurance, which means they're not able to address those mental health, those physical health needs that they have. And 12% of the probation population tends to be reincarcerated, with 27% of the parole population becoming reincarcerated. And we're more likely to see people of color, poor, and low levels of education overall within the probation and parole populations. So with that information, these authors argue for a shift in focus to social integration and economic justice from crime prevention and risk reduction that we've seen. So community supervision really does not reduce recidivism. It's those therapeutic tools that community supervision uses that reduces recidivism. And we see that community supervision can trap people in cycles of incarceration and supervision. Part of it is a result of fines or fees that can keep people on supervision, though I will say the majority in Pennsylvania will release an individual if all they owe are fines and costs. And once the max date hits, especially in Pennsylvania, we typically will release someone from supervision, and that will those fines and costs just go to a collection agency for them to pay. So we don't extend their supervision for that. And now with Act 44, we actually can't. Simply because someone owes fines and costs, because we know that this population typically comes from poverty-stricken areas. They have lower education, as we just saw. They don't do as well at holding employment or having stable long-term jobs. So how are they able to pay those? They don't have housing. They don't have all of those basic needs being met because they're low on funds. So the last thing they can pay are their fees and fines for supervision. And then what began as rehabilitative really shifted to more of a law enforcement view in the 1980s because of that tough on crime era. So we really need to go back to that rehabilitative era, which I can say in the probation world in Pennsylvania, we really are focused on rehabilitation now, using evidence-based practices and what works, rather than simply just focusing on crime control and reducing risk. The system also harms individuals economically, professionally, and educationally. So if we prioritize probation conditions over a job, it sends a negative signal to employers, because being incarcerated for violations means that it's less time that a person can spend at a job, less time they can spend with their family, so then they can't contribute to society. It also disrupts their social networks. That could reduce reoffending by having those informal social control networks in place. So we need to keep in mind, though, that people are reincarcerated for new arrests, serious violations, or threat to themselves. And most of the time, these individuals do not have pro-social networks. So they're not going to have them anyway to help them desist from crime. Though, occasionally, you do have those family members that, will say, I've been telling her, she needs to stop hanging around that group of friends, that group of people. So they do have maybe one or two individuals in their lives who really are trying to push them towards the right path. And then social and economic integration can really improve communities and public safety. So when we have stable full-time employment and well-paying jobs, this reduces reoffending because they have a meaningful social role now. The focus there can then be on healthcare, income support, and employment assistance for these individuals, rather than simply focusing on risk reduction and reincarcerating people when they do something wrong. Really giving them those supports and focusing on integrating them socially and giving them a fair chance at being economically sound and stable. So some of the goals for policy change is that we should abandon the control and supervision model and instead really focus on housing and reentry planning, making sure these individuals have the supports in place and have a place to go when they're coming home, that they have the education and training necessary so that they can obtain stable full-time employment, and then giving employers incentives and removing those barriers to employment that we see so that they can gain financial freedom and have economic justice and reintegrate socially, because then by having a job or maybe participating in educational programs, they can really start being around those positive pro-social peers that are really going to bring them and take them down the right path. Our last chapter we're going to cover, last reading, was Homework Chapter 8, Back to Jail. So really, what I want you to take from this chapter is that this chapter talks about the reincarceration of the Boston Reentry Study participants. And they found that 38 of the 122 participants, so 31%, did return to prison. So reincarceration is typically viewed as failed reentry. And they found no difference in returning to prison based on gender or race. So there was no difference between those in who returned to prison. But some of the main factors were relapse, being on supervision, and being younger. So we talk about relapse. Relapse to addiction was strongest. So when drugs are readily available immediately upon the person returning home, and when they have friends or partners that use, it was easy for them to go back into using because their cravings were really high. So sometimes the path to incarceration looked like drug dealing or stealing and robbing to get money for drugs, or they would engage in physical aggression while they were high, which led them to be reincarcerated. Or they had positive drug tests while they were on supervision, which was a violation of their conditions. Then we also saw, being on supervision as a main reason for reincarceration. Those who were on supervision had a 2 times higher rate of being reincarcerated. So 60% of participants were released on supervision. And modern supervision really had drifted away from rehabilitation model. So keep in mind, this was written in 2018. So we are now again seeing that shift back to a rehabilitative model for supervision, because we realized that supervision and surveillance alone was doing really little to reduce recidivism. Again, instead it's cognitive behavioral therapies, it's motivational interviewing, which we'll learn about. It's using all of those evidence-based tools, therapeutic tools that helps. So caseloads were higher back then, and for some counties they still are. So POs really weren't able to spend that time working with a person on their goals and programming, and all they had was time to give drug screens, monitor curfew, and just collect fees. So they really didn't have time to do a whole lot of true work with these individuals, aside from making sure conditions were met and that the person wasn't getting rearrested. And then again, reincarceration rates here were 2 times higher for those on supervision. The argument can also be made that those on supervision were being monitored more frequently and had a closer eye on them. So when they did mess up, there were more opportunities to reincarcerate that person, whether it was a new arrest or it was based on a violation of supervision. And then the third one is being younger. So natural desistance from crime happens as one ages, and reincarceration follows a similar path for that. So 1/3 of the participants who were under 30 were reincarcerated, but less than a quarter of those who were over 50 were reincarcerated, just showing that people age out of crime, they age out of being incarcerated. And turning points are very important. So turning points typically involve either marriage or a job, which can provide the ability for a person to enter into a mainstream role and really feel a part of the community. So it gives them routine and others to monitor their social life so they don't reoffend. Essentially, they have those positive social networks helping to hold them accountable. So for some, those turning points was really reflecting on their life and realizing that those past behaviors just simply didn't align with who they wanted to be now and who they now were. In sum, the role of a reentry manager should be redefined and include the judge as the main overseer of a reentry process, according to one of your readings. Therapeutic tools are much more effective at reducing reoffending than supervision practices alone. And officer actions are more important than individual personalities in positively impacting people on supervision. When we talk about community supervision, the focus really should be shifted from that crime prevention and risk reduction to more of a social integration and economic justice model, really focusing on how do we help these individuals have the right social supports and become and be enmeshed back into their social communities, and how do we give them financial stability so that they can achieve their goals. And then relapse, being on supervision, and being younger were the 3 main factors associated with reincarceration among the Boston Reentry Study participants. So that is your week 2 lecture, and I hope that everyone has a fantastic week.